I woke up before dawn with a heavy heart and aching bones, knowing that today was yet another day of being invisible, a ghost in my own home. As I stepped into the cool, lonely kitchen of what was supposed to be our family home, I braced myself for the endless routine. Waking up, preparing breakfast that I knew no one would bother to taste, and then orchestrating the day's chaotic performance. Today, like every other day, I was the unsung hero behind the scenes, the one who wiped away tears and scurried about as if I were the glue holding this broken family together. My grandson Ethan's 6th birthday was supposed to be a joyful celebration, but for me, it felt like an imminent explosion of pent-up frustrations. I spent the early morning hours meticulously chopping vegetables and stirring sauces, my thoughts swirling with memories of countless birthdays when I had poured every bit of love and energy into every dish. Despite my tired body and the endless clatter of pans, I clung to a secret hope that flickered quietly inside me. Just that morning on a whim, one of those rare moments where I dared to dream, I had bought a lottery scratch-off ticket. I never expected to win anything more than a lousy consolation prize, but as I casually scratched away while kneading dough for the special birthday cake, my heart skipped a beat. I had won a staggering $1 million. In that moment, the promise of escaping the relentless, ungrateful cycle of my life filled me with an intoxicating blend of joy and defiance. But even that glimmer of hope felt fragile against the backdrop of a day that already reeked of sacrifice and neglect. The house was already buzzing with the cacophony of party sounds, children's shrieks, clattering toys, and the incessant hum of voices that never paused for breath. While I was buried in the kitchen, I became painfully aware of how little I really mattered. My daughter, Caroline, was too busy fluttering among the guests, her eyes quick to judge rather than comfort. My son-in-law, Jason, barely glanced my way as he laughed with the others, lost in his own little world of shallow conversation. And my husband, Thomas, oh Thomas! He lounged on the living room couch like he was some untouchable king in his own palace, content to let the weight of every dish fall solely on my shoulders. Every knife cut, every clatter of a pan, every droplet of sweat became a silent testament to the years I'd spent sacrificing myself for a family that never cared to notice. As I simmered stews and roasted meats, my mind drifted back to the countless times I had pushed my own dreams aside to be the perfect wife, mother, and grandmother. I remembered the nights I lay awake, wondering why no one ever asked me, "How are you, Mom?" Instead, my existence was measured in the dishes I cleaned, the clothes I washed, and the meals I cooked with a love that went unreturned. There was also that pesky voice in my head, the one that whispered, "You deserve better," even as every fiber of my being was resigned to this endless routine. And on that fateful morning, as I held that winning lottery ticket between trembling fingers, that voice roared louder than ever. It promised escape, a way to reclaim my dignity and rewrite the narrative of my life. I imagined packing my bags and leaving behind a life where every day was a relentless servitude. I envisioned a future where I no longer had to be the invisible woman, the forgotten caretaker, the unsung martyr of a family that failed to recognize my worth. Yet, even as that secret victory of $1 million ignited sparks of rebellion in my heart, a profound melancholy gripped me. I knew that before the night could fall, and before I could taste the sweetness of liberation, I had to endure this day, every exhausting moment a painful reminder of the roles I had been forced to play. That day was my stage, and I was trapped in a script that had been written by others, without any regard for my dreams or desires. My effort, my pain, my unseen struggles all melted into the background of laughter and frivolous chatter that echoed through the halls. I could almost hear the sarcastic chuckles of Caroline as she casually mentioned, "Mom, don't forget to bring out Ethan's favorite pudding later," as if my tireless labor was a mere accessory to the festivities. I could almost feel Thomas's dismissive tone even before the day had unfolded its worst moments. Every gesture, every offhand remark, reminded me that I was a relic, a leftover piece of a family that was too wrapped up in their own joys to care about my well-being. In the solitude of that silent morning, before the chaos of the birthday party swallowed me whole, I allowed myself a moment of vulnerability. I looked out the small kitchen window at the bleak dawn and wondered if anyone else ever felt so utterly exhausted by life. A bitter realization settled in my chest. If I were to spend the rest of my days invisible, it would be a silent death. But that winning ticket, that unexpected stroke of luck, whispered a promise of something else, something more. It was as if fate had finally decided that I was worth something, that I deserved to be seen, heard, and celebrated. As I continued to prepare the feast, each movement in the kitchen grew more deliberate, each action laden with unspoken defiance. I was no longer simply stirring a pot of stew. I was stirring the cauldron of my future, one where I might finally break free from the suffocating chains of obligation. I wiped my hands on my apron and resolved, with each breath, that one day soon, I would no longer be the damned kitchen ghost haunting a house that never truly belonged to me. That morning, as the heat of the stove mingled with the chill of loneliness, I made a quiet, monumental promise to myself. I would seize the chance to leave this damned cycle of sacrifice behind. I would someday walk out of this crumbling existence, take that ticket, and ride it all the way to freedom. It was the beginning of a revolution inside me, one that simmered quietly but steadily, fueled by every tear I had ever shed and every unacknowledged sacrifice I had made. I knew deep down that the path ahead would be riddled with obstacles. The very thought of leaving the familiar chains of this life was terrifying. But today, in this lonely kitchen before the party erupted into chaos, I allowed myself to dream the impossible dream of being more than just a servant to my family. I whispered it silently to the rising sun. I deserve to be remembered. I deserve to live my life for me. The promise of that $1,000,000 win was the spark that lit the fuse of my determination. And even though I would later face heartbreak, betrayal, and an excruciating journey of reclaiming my identity, that morning remained the turning point, the moment when I first tasted the forbidden sweetness of hope, and I vowed never to return to the shadows again. As I closed my eyes for a moment, imagining a life filled with adventure, respect, and unapologetic self-love, my resolve hardened. I would endure this day no matter how invisible I felt, because it was the prelude to the most important chapter of my life. And someday soon, I would rise from the ashes of this sacrifice as a phoenix, reborn in the light of my own worth, unafraid to shout my truth to a world that had long silenced me. After that searing declaration echoed through the dining room, everything shattered around me. I didn't wait for their shocked stares or snide remarks to marinate any longer. I grabbed my coat, the edges of my bruised pride still raw, and stormed out like a woman who'd finally had enough. The door slammed behind me with a finality that felt both liberating and terrifying. I hardly even looked back as I made my escape. Each step away from that wretched household felt like a chisel breaking off the years of imposed invisibility. Outside, the bitter night air hit me like a slap in the face. The cool wind carried the faint sounds of jeering laughter and whispered curses from inside. But I didn't care. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, and a wild cocktail of rage, sorrow, and newfound resolve surged through me. I needed space. Space to gather the splintered pieces of my shattered self, and space to start over. With trembling determination, I hailed an Uber, not caring about the fares or the future that waited. All that mattered was the escape, the chance to taste a little freedom. The ride itself was a blur. A frantic montage of dark streets and passing neon signs that reflected my inner chaos. Every bump on the road felt like a reminder of the countless hardships I'd borne in silence. I glanced at my reflection in the window, eyes swollen with tears and streaked with the grime of an existence spent in neglect. Yet beneath it all there shimmered a fire I hadn't known existed. A fierce, unyielding determination to reclaim my life on my own terms. Arriving at the hospital, I staggered through the emergency entrance, my body trembling not just from the burn of hot chocolate on my skin, but from the raw sting of betrayal that had accumulated over decades. The antiseptic smell and harsh fluorescent lights did little to soothe my pain, yet there was comfort in the familiar clinical routine. A kind nurse, noticing my distress, immediately ushered me into a treatment room. As they tended to the burns, cleaning the wounds with a sting that felt like 1,000 needles puncturing the past, I sat back and let the reality of the moment sink in. In that sterile room, every painful drop of antiseptic was a small sacrament, marking the end of an era defined solely by servitude and suffering. With time to reflect in that cold hospital bed, I embraced the bitter paradox. While the burns were an outward manifestation of my abuse, they were also the first physical reminder that my body, and my soul, was yearning for healing. I clutched my lottery ticket in my pocket. That serendipitous moment earlier had ignited a rebellious spark in me. It wasn't just about the money, no, it was so much more. It was a ticket out of the suffocating labyrinth of my past, A tangible promise that there was an alternative to a life where my existence was taken for granted. Every minute that passed on that hospital bed, amidst the drone of doctors and the rhythmic beeping of monitors, I resolved to leave behind the ghosts of endless sacrifices. After my treatment, while the sting of the burns gradually faded under fresh bandages and new hope, I took the hardest step of all. I left the hospital with more than just my physical wounds patched up. I left with the unshakable decision to never return to that dismal life. With a modest sum from my soon-to-be claimed $1 million winnings burning in the back of my mind, I signed the necessary documents in a sterile, unfriendly apartment complex miles away from the oppressive home I'd known for so long. The apartment was a meager space, with creaky floors and a single small window that barely filtered the morning light, but it was mine. Every creak and shadow in that space spoke of independence, of a future unconstrained by someone else's needs. The next few days were filled with the kind of chaos only true rebirth can spark. I spent long hours setting up my new sanctuary, dusting off cobwebs not only from old corners but from the recesses of my buried dreams. I rearranged furniture, hung new pictures, and painted the walls in bright hues that I'd never dared before. Every small change was a declaration. I was no longer bound to serve someone else's narrative. I was reclaiming mine. But the final act of defiance was yet to come. Even as I attempted to rebuild the walls around my fragile independence, the relentless tide of family drama followed me. It wasn't long before my ex-husband Thomas and his charming new flame Diana began their own twisted campaign on social media, crafting their senior love story as if it were a Hollywood fairy tale. Their overpolished videos, filled with saccharine smiles and carefully curated memories, were meant to rewrite our history with glossy filters and empty promises. Yet every time I saw their post, I felt a renewed fury, and more than that, a burning need to unmask the truth. Late one sleepless night, fueled by bitter resolve and countless cups of black coffee, I began documenting my own story. My trembling fingers set up a modest camera in the sparse light of my living room. With a raw vulnerability that caught me off guard, I recounted my morning, the bitter taste of failure in the kitchen, the scalding shock of hot chocolate, the crushing betrayal in the dining room. Every word was a catharsis, every shaky admission a key to unlocking the hidden chapters of my life. I showed them the scars, both physical and emotional, that their neglect and arrogance had etched into my soul. I shared my triumph, the lottery win that symbolized more than material wealth. It represented my right to rewrite my destiny. The video was raw and uncut, a stark contrast to the overproduced narratives Thomas and Diana paraded online. When I posted it, I knew there would be harsh words, criticism, and accusations of overreaction. But as the comments and messages started to roll in, a flicker of understanding illuminated my battered heart. People saw the truth in my words, a truth born out of years of silence, a truth that rang clear amidst the cacophony of manufactured cheer. There were those who saw me as a victim and others who cheered for my rebellion. Every reaction was a step further away from that life I had left behind. In the midst of this tumult, I began to plan my next moves. I decided to channel the overwhelming mix of pain and hope into tangible actions. With the money I'd soon claim, I resolved to upgrade not just my living space but my entire existence. I enrolled in cooking classes, not to return to the old mindless routines of preparing endless meals for an ungrateful family, but to rediscover the joy of cooking for myself, a celebration of personal freedom rather than obligatory servitude. I even set aside a portion of the winnings for a future trip, an adventure where I would travel solo, exploring the vast beauty of this country that I had been too long confined in silence. Alaska's northern lights, New Mexico's expansive deserts, the bustling streets of New York. I would visit them all on my terms. Every day grew brighter as I transformed the physical and digital spaces around me. The once lonely apartment began to echo with the sound of my laughter, my voice growing stronger and more confident with every shared memory and every uncovered truth. I even started writing a blog, a raw, unfiltered diary of my journey from abandonment to self-empowerment. Each post, every heartfelt word, was a small rebellion against the world that had long ignored my worth. As the final pieces of my old life were dismantled, I realized that the pain I had endured wasn't wasted. It was fuel for the rebirth of a woman who had been too long crushed under the weight of duty and silence. I had left behind the broken home where I was nothing more than a background character, and I was beginning to craft a new narrative in which I was the undeniable star. In that singular, pivotal moment when I finally closed the door on the past, I felt something I hadn't in decades. A potent mix of terror and liberation. I knew the road ahead would be riddled with challenges and heartbreaks, but for the first time, I was not afraid to face them head-on. I was determined to live boldly, unapologetically, and if that meant cursing, crying, and screaming along the way, so be it. Now, as I settle into the fragile calm of my new home, I can almost see the horizon of limitless possibilities stretching out before me. With every painful step I took to leave that hellish house behind, I found strength. With every scar that marked my body, I found resilience. I was no longer a silent sufferer, no longer the invisible woman burdened with the invisible weight of ungrateful love. I was reborn, a phoenix rising from the ashes of a life defined by neglect, ready to embrace a future that was mine alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a war I'd been forced into. A personal battle for every scrap of dignity that had been stolen from me over the years. As I sat alone in my new apartment that very night, the silence was deafening yet somehow comforting. I knew that once the ashes of my old life cooled, a raging fire would ignite a transformation unlike any I'd ever imagined. The decision I'd made was irrevocable, and with it, I had unleashed a tidal wave of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me, but I was ready. I was ready to fight back. In the quiet hours before dawn, while the rest of the city lay still and oblivious, I began mapping out a new plan for my life. My battered body, still tender from the burn, became the blueprint for a revolution inside me, a rebellion against every slight, every neglectful word, and every moment of self-doubt that had dogged my footsteps. I started by scribbling down a list. First, secure my financial independence using that incredible $1 million win. Second, rebuild my sense of self by learning and exploring what I'd forgotten about who I was outside of the roles imposed on me by this suffocating family. And third, let the world know my story in its raw, unfiltered truth. I recall that moment vividly. In the early hours, a storm of cold coffee and tear-stained notepads lay scattered on my tiny kitchen table. I had found strength in these meager items: a pen, a notebook, and a burning desire for liberation. I wrote furiously, each word a declaration of the truth I'd long harbored. I reminded myself that every expletive I'd ever silently mouthed during those years of abuse was now a weapon. Fuck your pity, I scribbled in bold across the top of a fresh page. I'm done being your doormat. It wasn't just a fight for freedom. It was a reclaiming of every piece of my identity that had been trampled underfoot. Outside, the city was waking up. I stepped out into the crisp air, feeling the first hints of autumn bite at my skin. The golden glow of a new day was a stark contrast to the dark corridors of my past. I hailed another ride, this time, not out of desperation but with a determined purpose, and headed straight for a local community center known for empowering individuals like me. There, amid upbeat music and candid conversations, I found kindred spirits. Older women and men who had once suffered in silence, only to rise and claim their voices later in life. Their stories were like embers that warmed my battered heart and sparked visions of endless possibilities. Together we planned workshops, meetups, and even a blog where we would chronicle our journeys. Every shared story was a reminder that the pain we endured wasn't a personal failing. It was the cumulative result of a society that too often forgot about the vulnerable. But even as I began to surround myself with new allies, my past wouldn't let me fade quietly into oblivion. My ex-husband Thomas and his new paramour Diana continued to parade their distorted version of our family history across social media. Their glossy senior love story videos were everywhere, laced with manipulated footage and saccharine music. Every time I saw their posts, a fresh surge of anger coursed through me, yet it was tempered by a newfound clarity. I had nothing to prove to them. Their venomous efforts to rewrite our history only validated my decision to leave. I started recording more videos, raw, unedited, sometimes profane monologues in which I recounted every betrayal, every dismissive comment, every moment of abandonment I had suffered at their hands. I spoke to the camera as if it were a trusted confidant, letting the words flow without filter or apology. One night, after a particularly cathartic session of recording, I received an outpouring of support from strangers on the internet. Messages of solidarity, encouragement, and shared heartbreak poured in from across the country. A young woman wrote, Your story resonates with me. I used to feel invisible too. Thank you for showing us that it's okay to scream your truth." Those words were a balm to my wounded pride. They affirmed that my struggle, as painful as it was, had a purpose. I was not alone in my fight. There were countless others determined to break free from the chains of neglect and invisibility. Yet, even in the midst of this burgeoning rebellion, there were nights when self-doubt crept in. Lying awake in the dark, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake leaving behind everything I had ever known. Was I abandoning the life I'd built, even if it had been built on crushed dreams and silent sacrifices? The memory of Caroline's tear-filled eyes, the shock in Jason's silence, and the smug contempt in Thomas's voice haunted me. But then I would remember the intense burn of that hot chocolate, the searing pain that had sparked my transformation, and I would know deep down that I could no longer live as a ghost. Those memories, painful as they were, became the fuel for my resilience. I vowed to turn every setback into a stepping stone, every insult into a badge of honor. My body bore scars, both visible and hidden, that marked every moment of suffering. And yet, in each scar, I saw the outline of my strength, a testament to a woman who had endured more than most could imagine. I started exploring new hobbies, diving into art and literature that celebrated the raw, unvarnished truth of human experience. I even took up jogging at dawn, a symbolic gesture of shedding the weight of my past with every mile I ran. As the days turned into weeks, my modest apartment transformed into a sanctuary of self-expression. Fresh, vibrant colors replaced the dreary, muted tones of my former home. Every piece of art on the walls, every carefully chosen ornament, was a reminder that I was finally living for myself. I began hosting small gatherings in my living room, inviting others who had experienced similar betrayals and abuse to share their stories. These meetings turned into sessions of mutual healing, fierce laughter, and sometimes raw, tearful confessions. In each conversation, I recognized the same familiar spark of rebellion, a collective yearning to reclaim power and rewrite our narratives. There were moments, however, when the weight of my decisions and the enormity of my new path pressed down like an avalanche of despair. Late at night, when the energy of the day had been spent and silence enveloped the apartment, I would pick up my phone and reread the vitriolic comments on my videos. Some were scathing, filled with venomous vitriol that made my heart ache. But I learned to sift through the noise, holding on to the genuine, heartfelt messages that uplifted me. I reminded myself that sometimes the harshest criticisms came from those who had never known the meaning of sacrifice, the very ones who had abandoned me. With each passing day, the transformation was undeniable. I was no longer merely surviving, I was thriving. I started investing in courses that taught me about financial management, legal rights, and even digital marketing, determined to make my voice heard on my own terms. I envisioned a future where I'd not just escape the clutches of my past, but where I'd build a community of empowered, resilient souls ready to face the world head-on. And through it all, I remained relentless in my pursuit of truth that had been buried under years of silent suffering and unappreciated labor. I poured every ounce of pain, every flicker of hope, into my writing, my videos, and my conversations. I wanted the world to understand that my scars were not marks of weakness, but symbols of survival. A reminder that even when you're knocked down, you have the power to rise again. Standing in the soft light of dawn outside my window, I marveled at how far I'd come. The road ahead was still fraught with uncertainty, with battles yet to be fought and wounds yet to be healed. But for the first time in my life, I felt an unyielding certainty that I was in charge of my destiny. I had taken a stand and nothing, not even the ghostly remnants of my old life, could force me back into obscurity. I was on a path to not only reclaim my identity but to celebrate it in every scar, every victory, and every heart-wrenching moment that led me to this point. That journey was far from over, but as I embraced the fresh promise of each new day, I knew one fundamental truth. I would no longer be defined by the cruelty and neglect of the past. Instead, I would forge a future where I was the heroine of my own story, a story that no one could silence or rewrite. With every broken chain and every brave, defiant step, I was building a life where my voice, my pain, and my triumphs would echo for all to hear. And damn it, I was ready to shout it from the rooftops. The next morning arrived with a stark clarity that felt almost surreal. A final day where I would close the chapter on a life that had choked me for far too long. I woke to the soft, unyielding hum of independence in my modest apartment, each ray of early sunlight a reminder that I was finally free from the shadows of my past. Today wasn't just another day. It was the day I would cement my rebirth and finalize what I had longed for in the silent hours of countless broken nights. I dressed slowly, savoring every moment of self-care that once would have been unthinkable. With deliberate calm, I chose an outfit that made me feel unapologetically powerful. Bright colors, bold patterns, and accessories that reflected the vibrant spirit I had rediscovered. The reflection in the mirror no longer bore the haunted eyes of a subservient woman, but rather glowed with the fire of self-determination that I had nurtured in every agonizing step of my escape. With a final resolute breath, I left my apartment and headed toward the courthouse. Every step on the pavement resounded like a heartbeat, firm, determined, echoing the rhythm of a soul that refused to be trampled by the weight of its old scars. As the courthouse loomed ahead, its stoic facade felt like the gateway to a new existence. A place where legal and personal finality merged into one empowering act of reclaiming my worth. Inside the courthouse, I sat in a cold waiting room, surrounded by strangers whose lives might be entangled in struggles like mine. I felt their silent support in the sterile air, an affirmation that I was not alone. Hours ticked by in what felt like an eternity, each minute a bridge between who I once was and the fierce woman I was becoming. I replayed memories of the past. The endless, silent hours in the kitchen, the dismissive sneers from Thomas, and the haunting moment when Ethan's small hands had flung hot chocolate that burned more than just my skin. I remembered every tear, every stifled cry, and I let them fuel the quiet fury that now surged through me like a tidal wave. Finally, my name was called. Standing before the judge, I felt the full weight of every sacrifice and every bold act of defiance that had led me here. I handed over my papers with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the intensity of every emotion bound in the ink of my story. In that moment, I was no longer a silent martyr to a family that had never seen my true worth. I was a woman unafraid to rewrite the narrative of her life, no matter how painful the process had been. The judge's gavel fell, echoing through the courtroom like a resounding verdict of liberation. As the formal decree of my divorce was read aloud, a wave of relief crashed over me. A cathartic release from decades of suffocation and neglect. Across the room, I glimpsed Thomas and Diana seated together, their smug expressions faltering for a second before they too sank into silent indignation. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. I had severed the final tie with a past that had decimated my self-esteem and stolen my dreams. Stepping out of the courthouse, I paused for a moment in the crisp autumn air. A gentle breeze ruffled my hair and carried away the last vestiges of doubt. I could feel the weight of the world lift from my shoulders as I looked up at the sky. A vast, boundless expanse of possibility. In that instant, I promised myself that I would never again allow anyone to dictate my worth. I was done being invisible. I was done with compromise. I hailed a cab and began my journey home. This time not as an escape but as a return to myself. In the ride, I allowed my mind to wander over the future I was determined to craft. Every mile felt liberating, each turn a promise of new beginnings. I planned to use part of my $1 million winnings to invest in my future. Attending classes, traveling to places that I had only dreamed about, even starting a small business that celebrated my passion for cooking. Not for someone else but for me. I pictured a future where I'd host intimate gatherings not as a servant, but as the esteemed guest of honor in a community that cherished authenticity and resilience. Back in my apartment, the transformation was already taking form. I spent the afternoon rearranging my space once more. This time with the fervor and joy that came from living a life solely on my terms. I hung vibrant artwork that reflected my journey, lit candles with soothing scents that matched the newfound warmth in my heart, and even played a playlist of songs that celebrated freedom and rebirth. Every object, every color, every note was a declaration of the new me. Gone were the drab, muted tones that had mirrored the life I once endured. In their place were hues that screamed vitality, empowerment, and a fierce refusal to be subdued. That night I decided to commemorate my newfound freedom with a small celebration. Just me, a bottle of fine wine, and the incredible company of my own thoughts. I toasted to all the pain that had shaped me, to the tears that watered the seeds of resilience, and to the future where I was finally the hero of my own story. I allowed myself to feel every emotion, intense, raw, and beautifully unfiltered, knowing that each one was a stepping stone toward a life where my voice would be heard and cherished. As the final vestiges of the day drifted into memory, I sat by my window and wrote a long, heartfelt letter to my former self. A letter filled with gratitude for having survived the darkness and courage for the battles that lay ahead. I signed it with a promise. Never again would I allow anyone to diminish my light or silence my truth. The words flowed onto the paper with a grace I hadn't known in years, each sentence a tribute to the strength that had been forged in the fire of my adversities. In that moment of serene solitude, I realized that every hardship, every injustice, had been a necessary part of this arduous journey. The pain had been excruciating, the betrayal soul-crushing, but it had also sculpted me into a person who was unyieldingly fierce and incredibly free. I was finally ready to embrace the life that waited beyond the borders of that toxic past. A life that was vibrant, unpredictable, and completely my own. With my future unfolding like a breathtaking sunrise, I closed my journal and looked to the night sky with unburdened hope. I could almost see the outlines of adventures waiting to be written, friendships yet to be forged, and a love, self-love, that was as deep and unshakable as the stars themselves. And damn it, if there was one thing I was sure of, I was no longer defined by the shattered remnants of my old life. Instead, I was the embodiment of survival and transformation, a testament to the fact that even in the face of relentless darkness, one can emerge into a brilliant, unassailable light. As I drifted off to sleep that night, the echoes of the past were replaced by the promise of an uncharted, fiercely beautiful tomorrow. I was free, unapologetically so, and I knew that my journey was only just beginning.